My book sets out to explore a puzzle, and it explores two communities. You know one of them very well, artificial intelligence. And the other one is intelligence augmentation, or IA, a term that might be less familiar, at least, to people outside of Silicon Valley. You might know it as the Human-Computer Interaction Community, HCI. Even if you augment human intelligence with these machines, with AIs, you get a dichotomy between these two communities, and you get a paradox. Because if you give people more power, you displace people. And that's one of the things I set out to explore. Beginning in sort of 2004 with the advent of the first of the grand challenges that DARPA held in terms of self-driving cars, I sort of cut over, and by 2010, in 2004, up until then, I was a reporter in Silicon Valley starting in 1977 and had written largely about personal computing in the internet. And in 2010, I made this bet that AI and robotics would have an equal impact on the world during the next decade to 3 decades that personal computing in the internet had on the previous 3 decades. It hasn't come up here, but I've taken to referring to the Turing test, which is sort of quite popular, as a test of human gullibility. And I would commend all of you to taking a look at an experiment that Microsoft is running right now in China called Xiaoice, Little Bing. There are 20 million people who are using a chatbot. And unlike Siri and Cortana, which are productivity tools, you ask them a question, they understand you, they try to implement it. Xiaoice is an entertainment companion. There are 20 million people who are using it. 10 million people are using it routinely. That means they're having multiple interactions with Xiaoice every day. It's a chatbot at the moment. 25% of the 10 million people have typed "I love you" to Xiaoice. 50% of those people have said thank you to Xiaoice. They call it toilet time. There's a young demographic. They go into the bathroom late at night and they have extended interactions. And I thought that was pretty creepy, and the people in Redmond actually thought that was pretty creepy. And then I talked to this researcher at IBM who's Chinese, and she said, "You don't get it. When we come to your country, we feel like it's very socially quiet." Xiaoice is this private space that's created in a world that's much denser than what we have in America, and I assume in Canada. So I found these two communities when I was writing my last book, which was called What the Dormouse Said, which were right around Stanford University at the dawn of the interactive computing era. There were 2 laboratories that were created. One was created by John McCarthy, who had already sort of invented Lisp. He'd coined the term artificial intelligence. He created time sharing. He arrived at Stanford in 1962. And he built the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab. At that point, he thought that building a working AI was a decade-long project. He wrote that into the DARPA grant. He would later come to say that building a working AI would take 10% of the resources of the Manhattan Project and 1.8 Einsteins. And I don't know about the 1.8 Einsteins, but Adam Shire, who ran the Kalo project at SRI, later sort of computed what they spent on Kalo, and they did spend about 10% of the Manhattan Project, and what they got was Siri. They didn't quite make it to working AI. But a tremendous amount came out of the Stanford AI Lab, a community of researchers that really transformed the world, and it hasn't gotten its due. I just thought as an aside, since we might look at where the term artificial intelligence actually came from. These are McCarthy's words. It came from a petty academic squabble. And it's fascinating in history to see that McCarthy, who thought that Norbert Wiener, was bombastic and a boor and wanted nothing to do with him, and particularly called out analog feedback as the reason why he wanted to create artificial intelligence as a field. And so we might think about revisiting cybernetics, actually, after all this time. I think it's really quite ironic. So McCarthy was on one side of campus, and Doug Engelbart, of course, was on the other side of campus. He created something called the Augmentation Research Center. And out of Engelbart's work, his researchers at a certain point left. Many of them went to Xerox PARC. Alan Kay ran a group there that created the modern personal computer. It's really quite ironic because Engelbart had been ridiculed in the 60s, and yet personal computing came to the fore. He'd been about word processing, and that was sort of not serious computer science in the 1960s. Steve Jobs would say it best, of course, eventually calling the personal computer a bicycle for the mind. And Doug's ideas won out in the end. So my book is about a series of characters who sort of made the transition from AI to IA. And the point is that these machines are designed by humans, and we embed our values in them, and that's a very optimistic point. The first person I looked at was a young man by the name of Bill Duvall, and Bill was the first one to cross over, I would argue. He started at SRI International in Menlo Park in the 1960s, late 1960s, working on Shaky. And of course, Shaky was the first real AI platform. It had been created by a man by Charlie Rosen, and Charlie had gone to the Pentagon and he'd convinced them to let him work on a model of a sentry. They asked him if he could carry a gun, and he said, at least 2 or 3. How many do you need? We've sort of forgotten about Shaky, but Shaky had a huge impact on the world. Ultimately, the stuff that's in your smartphones, such as Siri, navigation tools, all came from that original work. Bill, of course, sort of lost interest in Siri early on because there was this interesting group down the hall. It was Doug Engelbart's group. Bill went over and worked on Engelbart's group. October 29th, 1969, he had written the code for Node 1 of the ARPANET, the predecessor to the Internet. The wonderful story is about that. This was the Watson come here quick moment for the Internet. It was actually not sending a message. It was remote login. He typed LOG, and on G the network crashed, of course, because of a buffer overflow, which is really quite ironic if you know much about modern computer security problems. At the very dawn of the ARPANET, they'd already had that problem. But he went on to become a member of the Mac team. He wrote the first assembler and the first compiler for the Macintosh. So Terry Winograd, an AI wonderkind in the 1960s. Terry would leave, go to Stanford, work on AI for a decade, and then walk away famously from the field in the 1980s. And the important point is Terry Winograd would ultimately be Larry Page's dissertation advisor, and he would influence him into picking PageRank as his thesis topic instead of working on self-driving cars or spaceships or whatever else. And you could argue that PageRank became Google Search is arguably the most powerful augmentation tool ever created in history. If you come from Silicon Valley, you worship at the Church of Moore's Law. We call the church the Singularity. But the reality is we are in a hiatus right now. Moore's Law is maybe not forever, but is suspended. Just quickly, 5 quick things. Intel had this tick-tock strategy that was supposed to last forever. It is in hiatus now. They would redesign a generation of chips, and then they would create a new generation of chips. We're now tick-tock because they failed to get to 10 nanometers. Dennard scaling, clock speed, stopped a decade ago. We have this thing called dark silicon. You can't turn all the transistors on in the microprocessor of your smartphone at the same time. If you did, it would melt. So you can't use all the transistors. The cost of transistors has stopped falling at the moment. And finally, we're about a decade behind schedule on exascale supercomputers. Moore's Law is just really not happening. And out of that, you get a set of things that I think we just haven't come to grips with. And one of them is that it's going to push any kind of singularity back a long way. What was wonderful to me this spring in being at the Stanford Associates affiliates program for all the semiconductor manufacturers, and they were grappling with this slowdown in Moore's Law. And at the end of this event, I ran into a young computer architect from Harvard, a man by the name of David Brooks, and he was giddy because basically he said, now it's our turn. Now we make our way forward with human creativity. Not that this acceleration is over, but we're going to make our way forward episodically based on human advances. Just a couple of brief things to sort of frame where we are. This is common wisdom on the state of robots today. This is Boston Dynamics, a machine designed by Mark Raybert, arguably the best designer of walking locomotion systems in the world. One of the companies was bought by Andy Rubin. Not a lot of people know what Google's planning to do, but when Andy was going around and acquiring those companies, his vision was the Google car would drive up to your door and the Google robot would hop off the back and deliver your package. So that's, that's the potential. And this is where we actually are. So you really had to go to the DARPA Robotics Challenge, the Rescue Challenge this spring to see where things are. 24 of the best design teams in the world, funded with millions of dollars, research funding, 18 months to do it, and most of them couldn't open the door on the first task. 3 of them did complete the task, but at the end, Gil Pratt's son, Gil Pratt was the research manager who organized this, said, if you're afraid of the Terminator, just keep your door closed. So that's ground truth. So I was one of the people, just a note of confession, I was one of the people who sort of started this recent period of anxiety. I began by writing about lawyers who are making $400 an hour and legal aides who are making $35 an hour who are being displaced by programs that do a demonstrably better job of reading legal documents than humans. And I was having this debate with Danny Kahneman, the behavioral economist, and my hair was on fire, and I was saying, there's going to be disruption in China when the robots get to China and do manufacturing. He said, you don't get it. If we're lucky, in China, the robots will come just in time. And I said, what do you mean? And he pointed out what was going on in China in terms of demographics. And as I began to look around the world, I realized that the world as a whole, with the exception of Africa, is aging at a dramatic rate. Not only is China aging, but Japan is aging, Korea is aging, the United States is aging, Europe is aging, and nobody sort of looks at the role that demography plays. And I'll tell you, demography is going to trump technology, and if we are lucky, the robots will show up just in time. So Toyota did something very interesting in the last couple of years. They began to put humans back in the manufacturing line, which suggests something about the limits of these systems. The system is perfect. The Toyota assembly lines are amongst the best in the world, but they don't improve themselves. And so they put the humans back to improve the manufacturing line. The other thing Toyota did recently that I think was really dramatic is in investing $1 billion in a laboratory next to Stanford, they didn't focus on self-driving cars. They focused on cars that will make humans better drivers, an important distinction. That's an augmentation term. 2 final thoughts. Keep going the wrong way. This is my mantra as a Silicon Valley reporter over the last 3 decades. Never mistake a clear view for a short distance. And just, I talked about McCarthy in 62. The first reference I found was the New York Times report on the invention of the perceptron in 1958. At that point, we thought that a thinking machine was only a year and about $10 million away. And so come full circle, back to Wiener. Wiener wrote first cybernetics in 1949, and then in 51 he wrote The Human Use of Human Beings, and I think his words are important. We can be humble and live a good life with the aid of machines, or we can be arrogant and die. Thank you.